Good evening, I'm Cynthia Ng and this is AWANI Tonight. Majority of brought-in dead cases unaware they had contracted COVID-19. Health Ministry urges vigilance. And Russia and Ukraine due for second round of peace talks. More on that coming up. The public, especially senior citizens with symptoms such as fever and cough, have been urged to immediately seek treatment at health facilities. According to the Health Ministry, it found that a majority of COVID-19 brought-in dead cases were those who did not know they had been infected. Health Minister Khairy Jamaluddin disclosed of the 113 brought-in dead cases between February 5th and 21st, only 9% knew of their infection status. He added that based on surveys, more than 50% of relatives said they believed that their family members who died were only mildly ill, and as such, they were not referred to a medical facility promptly. Sabah, he said, reported the highest number of brought-in dead cases over the time period, followed by Selangor. Meanwhile, Khairy shared that some 350,000 elderly Sinovac recipients had yet to come forward for a booster shot. He warned that this exposed them to a higher risk of serious infection and death. Those above 60 and Sinovac recipients had until March 31st to get a booster jab or risk losing their fully vaccinated status. Khairy said the deadline is final. Many Malaysians were forced to draw down their savings to cope with the impacts of the pandemic. Among EPF members, some 6.1 million people have less than 10,000 ringgit left in their accounts. According to Dr. Hafizali Iqbal Hussein from Taylor's University, the situation has exposed the lack of social protection in dealing with adverse shocks in the economy, especially for those who are self-employed or working in the informal sector.
This brings about the bigger issue, about the issue of social insurance pillars, such as unemployment allowance, Most of these benefits tend to accrue to the formal sector workers who can afford to make the contributions, And this sort of pillars tend to neglect, people who are working in the informal sector, They cannot access social insurance benefits due to non-contribution, They are often left behind in means-tested, tax-funded social assistance, In terms of coverage and adequacy, the social protection remains a pressing issue in Malaysia, where almost half the working age population do not have any specific social insurance scheme.
The gap between those who will be able to securely retire and those who struggle is likely going to grow. And fueling this problem is income inequality.
So the focus from the government's point of view is ensuring affordability of good and quality food, affordable childcare, and access to early years education. All of this adds up to reducing income inequality in the long run. Instead of targeting inequality explicitly, the policy focus should be a paradigm which has shifted towards a life cycle approach. So the target should be looking at core risks such as disability, sickness, unemployment, old age, childhood. And this is going to ensure that everyone or the entire society is able to overcome and resilient to shocks. So we can overcome these catastrophic threats throughout our lifetime.
Illegal loggers may face a minimum of 5 to 20 years in jail and fines of up to 1 million ringgit once amendments to the National Forestry Act is passed. The amendment to the bill was tabled for first reading in the Dewan Rakyat today by the Deputy Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Dato' Ali Biju. It will include harsher penalties on a range of offences involving forest reserves.
Among the offences that will involve heavier punishments is illegal possession of forest produce. The fine for those found guilty will be increased to a maximum of 200,000 ringgit, while jail time of a maximum 5 years will be raised to 10 years. Meanwhile, those involved in burning may be fined up to 100,000 ringgit compared to 50,000 previously, or imprisoned for a maximum of 7 years compared to 5 years before, or both. As for rubbish dumping, a fine of up to 20,000 ringgit, double the previous fine, or imprisonment for up to 3 years, or both.
Poachers are the top reason for dwindling numbers of wildlife, such as the Malayan tigers and sun bears. To strengthen the protection of these vulnerable species, Siti Hawa Abdul Wahid from environmental advocacy group Kuasa says the government should involve indigenous communities in anti-poaching efforts.
We have to recognize what is the main stakeholders involved in the our wildlife habitat, because they cohabitate their wildlife together with the local forest dependent community, which is our indigenous people. Actually, we in Malaysia, we already have this one, I don't think it's specific, just one official indigenous team. It's called Senoi Prak. It is an official, I don't think it's military, I think it's like one unit of the police, where it help the police in whatever issues happening in the forest.
The fight against poaching must shift to empowering the Orang Asli communities.
By empowering them on their environmental rights, what are the rights they have, their land rights. So when they know the status of the territory they are in, I think the sense of protecting, the sense of belonging is it will become more deepened. Then thus empowering them with the monitoring skills, empowering them on the, I think, combat skills, because we know poachers are not just normal people, they were also equipped with combat skills.
World Wildlife Day 2022 focuses on recovering key species for ecosystem restoration. Tonight on Consider This, we ask conservation biologist Dr. Nur Zafarina Othman about living with Bornean elephants and Sabah's rich natural heritage which this magnificent animal represents. We'll go for a quick break. Stay with us.
Semua yang terjadi adalah berita, tetapi tiada siapa yang boleh bawakan yang terkini dan tergempar seperti kami.
Dilihat hanya memberi wang tanpa matlamat yang tepat. Dia tidak melakukan apa-apa kesalahan.
Untuk mendapatkan jawapan yang bermakna, kita perlu soalan yang tepat.
Amat sedih dengan apa yang berlaku kat atas.
Tiada ruang untuk berita palsu.
Negara kita telah merekodkan kes harian baru sebanyak
hanya fakta yang diberikan.
Amat penting untuk meneruskan perjuangan negara melawan pandemik ini.
Sentiasa memastikan suara anda, suara rakyat didengari.
Kenapa?
Membawakan apa yang penting di mana sahaja anda berada.
Kerana kita hendak putuskan rantaian jangkitan.
Belanjawan dan pendekatan.
Welcome back on to developments in Ukraine. Russia says its forces have captured the city of Kherson, the first major city to fall a week after launching its invasion of Ukraine. The mayor of Kherson says Russian troops were in the streets and had entered the council building. Kherson is located not far from the Crimean Peninsula and annexed by Moscow in 2014. Russia is intensifying attacks on other key cities. The capital, Kiev, continues to be under bombardments with multiple major explosions reported. Although Pentagon said a massive Russian convoy north of Kiev are stalling due to regrouping and logistical challenges. The United Nations say nearly 1 million people have fled Ukraine since Russia launched the invasion, with more than 500,000 seeking refuge in Poland. Most are women and children. Russia has for the first time said it sustained heavy military casualties during its attack on Ukraine, with nearly 500 troops killed. Ukraine, meanwhile, has claimed that far more Russian soldiers have been killed. Representatives of Ukraine and Russia are expected to meet for a second round of peace talks in Belarus. Ahead of the meeting, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that while Moscow is ready for talks, it will not stop targeting Ukraine military infrastructure. He added that the Russian delegation had submitted its demands to Ukrainian negotiators earlier this week and is now waiting for Kiev's response in the second meeting. Among the demands, Russia will insist on provisions that Ukraine will never again represent a military threat to Russia. But Lavrov said it will be up to Ukrainians to choose what government they should have. He also voiced regret for civilian casualties and insisted that the Russian military is using only precision weapons against military targets. Athletes from Russia and Belarus have now been banned from competing at the Beijing 2022 Paralympic Winter Games. The decision came after protests and threats of boycotts forced the International Paralympic Committee to make a U-turn less than 24 hours after announcing it would allow the athletes to compete as neutrals when the Games open on Friday.
The situation in the athletes' village is escalated and has now become untenable. With this in mind, and in order to preserve the integrity of these games and the safety of all participants, we have decided to refuse the athlete entries from RPC and NPC Belarus. To the para-athletes from the impacted countries, we are very sorry that you are affected by the decisions that your government took last week in breaching the Olympic truce. You are victims of your government's actions.
This marks the latest of multiple sporting sanctions that have been imposed against Russia following its invasion of Ukraine.
On to the floodings in Australia. Around 500,000 people in Sydney and its surrounding areas have been told to evacuate or prepare to flee floodwaters as heavy rain continued to lash the eastern parts of the country. The floodings had claimed at least 10 lives so far.
Dozens of suburbs were on high alert as major flooding was expected along several rivers in and around Sydney, Australia's most populous city home to 5 million people. Evacuation orders were issued to 200,000 residents, while evacuation warnings were sent to another 300,000. Floodwaters were also rising in Brisbane, Australia's third most populous city. Brisbane received around 80% of its annual rainfall over the last 3 days.
The pandemic has underscored a need for a proper collection and disposal system dedicated for hazardous waste. We speak to Professor Agamutu Pariatambi from Jeffrey Sachs Centre of Sustainable Development about the system.
Unfortunately, we do not have a dedicated waste collection for hazardous waste in Malaysia, although this has been recommended many times. Even before the pandemic, even before the COVID, we have a lot of hazardous waste being generated at home, like, for example, the fluorescent tube, or, for example, the insecticides containers or the herbicide containers, and all with all the chemicals. Everything we throw together with the municipal solid waste, simply because we don't have a dedicated system of collection of this hazardous waste. So now it becomes even more pertinent with the COVID that they should seriously have some kind of a proper collection system that will actually save the environment and the human health.
He said it is pertinent for waste collection system that separates hazardous e-waste, clinical and solid waste.
They should have the category of useful waste and clinical waste. Clinical waste is the more dangerous to the environment and the public. So I think if there is a dedicated waste collection, probably they can have e-waste collection, say maybe once a month, but I think the healthcare waste should be probably collected at least once a week.
That is all we have for you on AWANI tonight. For all the latest news updates, head on to astroawani.com and Astro AWANI app. Thank you for watching. I'm Cynthia Ng. Good night.